Well, hello all. Welcome to Now We're Talking with Doug Pagitt, Friday podcast edition. This is my conversation with the wonderful Jennifer Butler from Faith in Public Life. Now, if you don't already know Faith in Public Life, you're going to be glad you tuned in to the podcast. Faith in Public Life is a group that organizes progressive faith leaders across different traditions and religions to act in the world in ways that are beneficial for all of us. It's exceptional work. You can find it at faithinpubliclife.org. You're going to, I think, so much enjoy the conversation with Jen Butler here. And if you're enjoying all the conversations, I'd encourage you to think about becoming a patron. Go over to Patreon and you can chip in for the podcast. That's how I'm paying for it, and I'd love to have your participation in it. You can go to dougpagitt.com to get to the link, or if you're already on Patreon, you can do it over there. So here it is, my conversation with Jen Butler from Faith in Public Life. Hey y'all, this is Jennifer Butler from Faith in Public Life in Washington, D.C., there on the screen, and Doug Pagitt here. I am so glad to be in this conversation with Jen. I think the work, Jen, that you do and Faith in Public Life does is super important. And I don't know how you describe yourselves, but I often tell people I think you are the premier and most exceptional faith-based organizing outfit in the country.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Would you agree that you're the...
I like the word premier.
Yeah, isn't that a great word? That's super elite that you are premier. So for people who, somehow haven't heard yet what Faith in Public Life does, there are so many things. Can you give a quick rundown of the kinds of work you're doing and how people can, generally be involved with you?
I can. So Faith in Public Life helps faith leaders realize their values in American public debates and public policy. So faith leaders across the country are working on social justice issues, and we want to have an impact beyond even preaching and teaching, which is critical, but we want to have an impact on legislation that impacts the lives of thousands, millions of people. So we enable faith leaders to have that kind of impact, whether it's working to address gun violence in their communities, police brutality, whether to protect immigrants, to protect millions of people from losing their healthcare reform. And we do that by, we have now a leadership network of 40,000 religious leaders, multi-faith, multiracial, all over the country. And so when we see opportunities for religious leaders to make a difference, which right now feels like it's every day and every hour, we contact them and help them weigh in an effective way.
So a little bit of history. The Faith in Public Life was initiated in a response like back in 2004. Is that right? Or 2006, 2004?
That's right. Yeah, we saw that we were losing the so-called values debate. Every time the press would talk about religious leaders, they would talk about Jerry Falwell and the likes of them. So we got frustrated with that, and we started Faith in Public Life to put social justice faith leaders front and center.
So that was back during the Bush administration, right? And which just seems like a lifetime ago. And you all were doing such great work to try to address all of these issues. I guess I'm just kind of asking, like, how does that feel right now when it feels like so much? Those feel like the good old days to someone like me, right? As a progressive faith leader, like, man, what I wouldn't give to be back in those days when, you could just say, well, we got to do something about classic conservatism. And this Donald Trump thing just feels like it's blown the whole thing to smithereens. And how are you doing in your own work, and generally speaking in the progressive faith leader organizing world? How are you thinking about this?
Yeah, I have two responses always to that question. One is, I feel like my hair has been on fire for the past year. But I'm always reminded, especially when I talk to people of color, that the groundwork for Trump has been laid for the past couple of decades. It goes deep in American history. The country was founded on slavery. We then moved into an era of Jim Crow. We now have the new Jim Crow in our criminal justice system and growing economic inequality. And so while, in some respects, particularly as a white person, I can look back on Bush and Reagan and think, oh, that seems like nothing compared to Trump. And in some sense, these things have been building and escalating one on the other. And maybe what we see in this era is that the veil has really come off on the deep, deep inequality and racism and bigotry that has been there all along. And Trump is just more overt about it.
Yeah, so I guess there's a sense in which that's the needed that's been the needed illness or cancer to sort of come to the surface that is so painful.
I think so. And I mean, there's still a danger too, in terms of what Trump is doing. He's kind of exceeded the Overton window and sort of made it okay to be overtly racist. And I think there is an inherent danger in that to our democracy, to people's everyday lived experience. We know that hate crimes are on the rise. So that's not to minimize, of course, that this presidency does mark a new sort of uptick in intensity to that. I'm deeply worried right now about our democratic structures and whether those will hold. Some days I have great hope because I see how people are resisting and standing up. And other days I feel overwhelmed that they're slowly being chipped away at.
Yeah. How's the spirit as you move across the landscape of progressive faith leaders? What's the sense? Is it, a lot of us, I speak for myself, super angry and depressed and full of a kind of rage,
Yeah.
Is that
I see
typical?
That, yeah.
What are you seeing in people?
I see that. And then I also at times see this incredible sense of joy that comes from struggle. So it's not a sort of happiness or, superficial joy. It's this sense of, because of the pain and the suffering that we see of being deeply connected one to another. And I have never in my life seen religious leaders showing up as boldly as they are showing up today. So, I think back to the beginning of the year, and one of the things we organized right away was opposition to Donald Trump's cabinet of bigotry. He was placing overt white supremacists in his cabinet, Jeff Sessions, chief among them. And so we organized opposition to that. And I remember, turning around at some of our press conferences, and we were having hundreds of religious leaders show up at these press conferences, and we were marching on the Senate. And Reverend Barber came in for one of those, and he was just amazing as well. And I remember feeling this tap on my shoulder, and I turned around and I saw a couple of people from my old congregation, which was a mixed congregation of, Republicans and Democrats. It wasn't very political. It wasn't very social justice oriented. And I constantly found myself surprised just turning around and seeing new people engaging, reaching out and forming partnerships. And that gave me a lot of joy. I also say that at these rallies and marches and press conferences, I've never felt more close to God. To me, that is a form of worship. And there's this one picture of me. I'm holding Reverend William Barber's hand, and we're marching off to do civil disobedience. And it's a reporter took it, but I'm smiling in the picture, and I know at that moment I was also terrified. But at the same time, I'm smiling because I'm looking behind me and I'm seeing all these people gathered for justice. And to me, that feels like the reign of God breaking in.
It's really refreshing to hear you talk about it. You're a great advocate for this. There's a lot of religious leaders who were trained up and came from a tradition where active political agenda, like not just in the generalities of political agenda, but specific things like this particular policy we want to see not pass. Here's particular policies we do want to see pass, which is some of the great work that Faith in Public Life does. But for a lot of people, that's not how they've thought about their role as a faith leader. They've seen it as we have these larger commitments about what it means to be a person of faith, and we're going to advocate those, and we're going to let the political system sort of deal with it at the political system level, but we're going to deal with it in the hearts and minds of people, and the policies will take care of themselves. So they try to stay out of that. Are you willing to do a 2 or 3 minute recruitment to the other way of thinking about that for people for whom it's just such a new way for them to think about a way of connecting their faith with particular political policies and agendas?
I love that question. And so if we start with the Hebrew scriptures, we see God getting involved in leading the people of Israel out of Egypt, out of bondage and out of slavery in Egypt and out of oppression. And over again, God says, because you were slaves in Egypt, here is how you are to treat other people. Because you were immigrants and refugees, here's how you are to treat immigrants and refugees. Mm-hmm. Then Isaiah 10 says, woe unto you who pass unjust laws, who bind the poor and oppress the needy. And so it's clear in the Hebrew scriptures and from the prophets that we are to set up our society in such a way as to honor who it is God calls us to be. Mm-hmm. And then moving in, as a Christian, Jesus says, whatever you did to the least of these, you do that to me. Mm-hmm. So when we turn away refugees, and Jesus was a refugee, we're doing that to Christ. Mm-hmm. We saw Jesus tackling the structures of his society by going into the temple and overturning tables, by breaking laws. Actually, on the Sabbath, he healed on the Sabbath, right. Yeah. Which was considered breaking the law.
Like
so
civil
I love
disobedience.
To think about that when it comes to healthcare reform.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So I would say you cannot be faithful if you're not applying your faith to all spheres of life. Mm-hmm. And that includes the communal sphere. Religion is not just personal, how I myself behave. We're called to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. And so that means that in every area of my life, I have to figure out how to extend that love of neighbor, which means I have to be concerned about voting. Mm-hmm. That's part of honoring human dignity and honoring God. I have to be concerned about public policies.
So I'm channeling a couple of people's questions that I know they have about this. I think your comments would be really helpful for them. One is our mutual friend, Jim Wallace, who back in, 2004 or 5 was famous with a book that came out. A lot of people picked up on it, God's Politics. And he makes this big argument, bumper stickers, the whole deal. Jim did a great job of conveying his idea on this, that God is not a Democrat or a Republican. That's echoed in another religious leader from another part of the country and part of the world, named Rick Warren, who is famous for having said, I'm not right wing or left wing. I care about the whole bird. Right? This kind of idea. That, hey, there's something more grand, and religious leaders are called to the whole. They're called to all of that, and not to the particular policies. So we want to care about. Now I'm riffing on their comments, but I hear this from a lot of other leaders. We do want to care about issues of voting, and we want to care about how people are treated in our world. We want to care about refugees, but we don't want to get into the particulars of this side versus that side. But Faith in Public Life picks a side regularly, and if people are not already on the newsletter, they should be, because sometimes people don't know what side to be on. You're really good at helping them know what side you think they should be on and inviting them to join that side. How do you reconcile that side of it where, oh no, we are full-on progressives in our approach to politics, to social good, and to our faith, and that those two seem to be so linked? Because there's a lot of people who've critiqued conservative Christians with being too linked to conservative politics. And I imagine you've thought that through.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to be specific when we speak faithfully to the public about our scripture and what specifically we think is in line with our scripture. And so if we're being vague about that, to me, it feels a little bit, dishonest.
Nice.
At the same time, I think we have to be very, very careful that we're not knee-jerk partisans. I actually would say, that I'm not being progressive or conservative. Many of our constituents would call themselves conservative. Mm-hmm. I would just say that I'm being faithful. I'm trying to be faithful to the teachings of Scripture. And sometimes, and in fact, most often recently, that has been, the policy advocated by some Democrats. But, if you look what's happening right now with sexual harassment, there are offenders on all sides, and we have to call out offenders on all sides. And sexual abuse should not be a partisan issue. I look for opportunities. And in fact, we've worked in states where we've built coalitions of Republicans and Democrats to work on issues like protecting pregnant workers.
Mm-hmm.
You can be fired if you're pregnant. That's okay to do in some states. And so in Ohio, we had a bipartisan piece of legislation protecting pregnant workers. In Georgia, we work with a Republican governor on several issues, on criminal justice reform, on trying to end gun violence. And I'm very proud of that.
Yeah.
And so I think if we're faithful, we will always look for diverse allies. And we'll have to be careful to make sure that we're standing up for our values and not following a party, because to follow a political party is idolatrous. We follow God.
Yeah.
And we can do that while also still being specific as to who's right and who's wrong.
Yeah.
And calling out specific people. And I think that's where people get a little nervous. Like if I call out Paul Ryan, who is Catholic, and tell him that his tax plan is unbiblical, then I think some people get nervous about that. But I think we have to be clear and do that in a civil way, but we have to be really clear about what we're saying.
I feel like that, for me, the work that you do and Faith in Public Life does has been so helpful in that way, to put the emphasis on the specifics and the real life implications of these things we say we care about, and to differentiate that from the feeling of just being a political, shill or hack or something, where you're just doing the bidding of a party and you're baptizing a particular political party's perspective with your faith and your religion. That's delicately balanced to be able to do that. Like the answer to that is in the nuance, it seems. And I think you do it well. How do you help church leaders translate that way of thinking, and then putting their own, name on a petition or advocating in their public spaces? How do you help them do that into their church spaces?
That's a great question. We've had a couple of training sessions, online webinars, to help clergy preach on these topics in their congregations. And although I said, I think we have to be specific as to what we are talking about. I mean, when I say we, that's the mission of Faith in Public Life.
Yeah.
And there are times when clergy representing their congregants can be very specific. Mm-hmm. And we helped run campaigns that help them really, call out the mayor of a city or the governor, be very specific about who's doing the right thing, who's doing the wrong thing. Yeah. But I would say also within congregations, everybody knows their congregation and knows how to educate and bring them along on topics and what's appropriate and what's not. And I really admire those, for example, who, I think this is a great season in which to preach on one of the 7 deadly sins, greed. We can preach about greed, not necessarily, name names or talk about specific tax plans or whatever, but lift that up as a value that people need to be applying as they think about decisions and as they interact with their members of Congress. And so I think every context, we need to find out how to be relatable and how to be appropriate to our context. But we've specifically, one of the things I'm proud of recently is in Columbus, Ohio. Columbus has one of the highest rates of police shootings in the country. You don't hear about Columbus very often, but it's the case. And so we've been convening a group of white and black clergy and interfaith clergy that have been meeting monthly to tackle that problem. And we just recently got the mayor to commit funding to do crisis intervention training, which has been proven to reduce police shootings across the board. They had the money there. They weren't, allocating it toward that. We put some pressure on. We did some press conferences. We called out the mayor specifically. We called out the police. We met with the police. We're holding them accountable, as Scripture would have us do. And they have begun to respond to us. And now they're going to allocate that funding and implement that training. And we'll stay on them to make sure that accountability stays there. But I'm really proud that the faith community could lead on that.
Jen, you and I have a mutual friend in the Washington, D.C. area named Mike Stavlin, and he pastors a church called The Table. And they have this phrase that they say on their voicemail if you call to find information about the church. He says something like, "And on Sunday mornings, the Table community meets together to call our own bluff and see if we really mean the things that we profess." Right? It's a great line. We meet together in order to call our own bluff. I feel like the work you guys are doing is calling faith leaders to call their own bluff if they really think these things matter, right? That how would you not talk about the specifics if you really are compelled by your faith that these notions and these ideas work. And
that is so true. That is so true. And I often find that clergy really and communities want to weigh in, but it's so difficult nowadays to figure out, like, how do we pressure the mayor? How do we get press attention? At what point do we want press attention versus having quiet meetings with leaders? And that's what we come in and help them do, because they have to fulfill the obligations of preaching and pastoral care. And so this is a particular kind of expertise that we can bring to the table. And I'm really excited when we call clergy and they say, "My God, where have you been all my life? This is just what I was looking for." Yeah. So sometimes we're calling people's bluff and we're pushing the envelope a little bit. But other times we're just helping give a lifeline to what they've been called to do all along.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, most pastors that I know, and no matter what system they're in, most of them feel like they're having to make really hard decisions about where they put their time and effort. And for so many people, they believe this notion that politics is in the bag. It's a rigged system. There's nothing you're going to be able to do about it anyway. Don't waste your time. All of those narratives that are in our popular culture are really alive for church people who then say, well, why would I waste my energy in that world if I could spend time doing something that's going to be so much more useful to people in another world? And you help not only clergy people, but you also help regular people, lay people in churches to catch a vision for this not being a simple waste of time that they're engaging in politics.
And I think I try to speak of this as a tool of evangelism as well. I think when people in our communities see that the church is showing up and making a difference and putting its words into action, that we're not being a bunch of hypocrites, that we're actually acting on God's love. And we're doing what Jesus said his mission was, speaking as a Christian here. Jesus said, "I've come to bring good news to the poor and free the oppressed and proclaim the year of God's favor." So if we're doing that, what does that look like in the world? It looks like ending police violence. It looks like ending gun violence. It looks like making sure people are fed and have health care. That's bringing about the reign of God here on earth. And we know that ultimately everything is in God's hands, but we can't be faithful if we're not God's hands and feet. And often it is lay leaders, not just clergy, but lay leaders who are really spending the time and doing the work.
And pressuring their pastor to get in the game.
That's right.
It happens all the time.
Most often, there's always strong lay leadership behind the clergy, and the best clergy honor that lay leadership.
And you made a nice distinction there that for you, as one part of Faith in Public Life, you come from and orient yourself in a Christian tradition and story. But Faith in Public Life is not a Christian organization; it's a faith leader organization. So it involves people of every faith that would want to be engaged with you.
Exactly. And we're really building those connections, especially now when religious minorities are being threatened. So we've been holding interfaith training seminars to build interfaith networks in several states just to strengthen that, because we know we all really need to be strongly linked at this time. So all of our networks are Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, whatever. We make them as diverse as possible. And I find there's a real hunger right now for people to get to know one another. And again, that becomes an issue of time and segregation. Our society today is still very segregated by neighborhood, by schools, churches, or communities of worship are the most segregated hours, our worship time. And so a lot of that is due to the history of racism in this country. And so we have to make, an extra effort to reach out. In one of our states, we had a group of white clergy that kept saying, we want to be more connected, but for some reason we haven't been able to diversify our gatherings. And so we made the simple suggestion that they start meeting in African-American churches and meeting on the other side of town instead of meeting in the big white church downtown. And that really right away just diversified everything.
Does a lot.
And then we all started to like refocus the issues that we were choosing to work on and so on. And so there's some really simple changes we can all make to get connected to one another in these dark times, because we're all going to need each other.
Hey, some of us have been talking about a little grassroots day, a coming out day for progressively minded religious people. In my case, as a Christian, we would say there's going to be a day in which you're going to come out publicly and say, because of my faith, I hold these values and I want to live in this way. So many Christian religious people, at least, who are progressive, feel like they have to downplay their religious life and convictions and narratives, and they very often would, give us a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. or a Rumi quote or something. They would totally do that before they would quote a book from the Old Testament or the Jewish scriptures or a book from the New Testament of the Apostle Paul or a quote from Jesus. That tends to get downplayed. And for a lot of us, we've spent a lot of time having to say to people, I'm a Christian, but I'm like this, right? And but I'm not one of those Christians. And it feels like there's kind of this need for a much more positive view where progressively minded people who are informed by their faith come out in a national kind of public way and do a because I'm Christian or because I'm a Jew or because I'm a Muslim, that's why I root this progressive value. Do you have any thoughts about the need for that kind of thing in the world? Do you sense that that's also needed? Is that a real thing?
I love that. When we first started Faith in Public Life, people were very reticent to speak out in public, specifically from their faith tradition. And I think a lot of that was because the Christian right had humiliated us. We felt like they had taken over what it meant to be Christian or to be religious, and we didn't want to look or sound like them. Yeah. And so I say, we had a kind of low self-esteem about ourselves. Yeah. But ironically, what that ended up doing is giving them more power. What we needed really was a counter voice, not reasserting, Christians are the best or, listen to the Christian voice. Not at all. It was more, we needed to have a robust moral debate. Yes. And so what we've ended up doing is we have the Christian right. Many of those folks that lead the Christian right, I'm not talking about evangelicals here who are different, but the Christian right, which has organized a lot of white evangelicals into what essentially is a white nationalist Christianity. And I'm thinking here of Franklin Graham and, Jerry Falwell Jr. and Pastor Jeffress and Trump's Presidential Advisory Committee. Those guys really are first and foremost white nationalist Americans who have couched Christianity in terms of a sort of patriotic Christianity. And we have to take that back. That's morally incumbent upon us to take that back. And so when we kind of come out as religious folks and help people understand what their faith is actually all about. I mean, one, it helps heal people's souls. So many people have been hurt so much, by this dysfunctional view of religion and have been abused. That's soul abuse. And so we can help people heal. We can help heal the nation. So I would definitely be down for a campaign like that.
Yeah, great. You made a really subtle and to me very important distinction there. You said, I'm not talking about the religious right, saying, I don't consider them the evangelicals. They're a group who has organized evangelicals to their cause, making a bit of a distinction there between your run-of-the-mill evangelical church or church leader or individual who would identify with that group and this other organizing group that has another agenda about it. Did I hear that right?
That's so important to say, because I mean, I grew up evangelical in the South. I was born again in high school. And one of the reasons I gave my life to Christ was because I was reading Luke chapter 4, where Jesus talked about his mission. And I was concerned about racism. Growing up in the South, I started hearing the N-word around in my community. And I was concerned about nuclear Armageddon and the Cold War. And I saw Jesus as having something to say about that. This was the Reagan 80s, and so Christianity at that time started to get swept up into the Christian right. But as a young evangelical, that never resonated with me. I had questions for both political parties. And so I think we need to make that distinction. And I'm really glad to see a lot of white evangelical leaders who have been standing up against Trump and his policies. And I think that gives me, a lot of hope. And the Christian right, if you look at the history of it, there's a lot that's been written on the history of it. It was funded by corporations. It was created by political operatives like Paul Weyrich to herd white Southern evangelicals into the Republican Party. And it was founded at first on school desegregation and racism, before they started lifting up the abortion issue. So I think we have to look at that history and understand that in part because if we don't do that, we're all divided one from another. So we're working very closely with evangelical leaders to take back that narrative and to advance policies that are just.
Yeah, well, I'm all for it. One of the projects I'm helping to launch is something called the Progressive Evangelical Institute. So it's a think tank for the study and advancement of progressive evangelical thought and action.
There's great.
Sort
we
of
need that.
There's kind of a missing academic and thought leader and policy kind of group from the progressive evangelical specific spaces where people find themselves. And so I think there's something afoot. I think something's brewing in the country. And I don't know if you feel this way, but I think that the election of Donald Trump was the one of the final signs. I don't know that it caused anything to happen. I think it showed where things sit. And this divide between white evangelicals and all other evangelicals who wouldn't identify in white culture, that's been a divide that people have really made a lot of, have used in a lot of really damaging ways. And I think that's really got to change. And it will come back together.
Yeah, it absolutely does. I'm glad you're going to do that. That's so critical.
Yeah. Can you say something about the Faithful Advocate project? That caught my attention. I thought it was a really great way for people to say, hey, I love what Faith in Public Life is up to. This is a conversation that's inspiring to me.
So you can sign up to get our action alerts and updates online at faithinpubliclife.org. And right now we're running a Faithful Advocate campaign so that you can become, as an individual, a member of Faith in Public Life. And we're also starting chapters around the country. We have offices in several states, but we're also inviting states to join, as chapters. But
what will a chapter do if someone says, "Hey, that sounds great. I'd love to have that here. I don't live on the East Coast, so I don't know that anybody thinks about us politically." Us in
we're
flyover
hoping to have
country.
chapters as far flung as Alaska and Maine, because those are really critical states. I mean, when you think about it, their senators are the key swing senators on healthcare and so many other issues. And so what that means is simply that we help train and support your advocacy work. And so we'll provide training and ongoing assistance to help you weigh in on public debates. So again, it's part of this effort. We have 40,000 people in our database who are working with us on various issues, and we want to make that relationship closer and more clearly expressed so that we can organize more effectively together. We have an election coming up in 2018 that's going to be really, really critical for the country. And so we hope we'll have revivals around the country to help call people back to their better angels. And we want to work with folks on building that movement.
Yeah, and I love the idea of you doing that in these local chapters. I'm in Minnesota, and that has been a reliably blue state all the way back to the 1984 election, when one state in the District of Columbia voted for Walter Mondale, and every other state went for Ronald Reagan. And Minnesota's the only one. Like, this is Hubert Humphrey land.
Wow.
And Donald Trump came within 10,000 votes of winning the state of Minnesota.
That's incredible.
This notion that there's any place that we should give up on and just say, well, let's not invest there, that's a waste of time and energy. I think it doesn't recognize and understand the way that ideas don't respect state boundaries, and that people are being influenced by ideas that are moving across state boundaries, and we have to be organizing in all the places. So I think that's really great.
That's absolutely right. And it's a spiritual matter too, because people are getting hoodwinked by this kind of racist and fear-mongering propaganda, right? Like, they're getting sucked in. I hear pastors say to me all the time, we have people once a week, Fox News has them all week long. So we're all up against a lot. And, I think of people who are very close to me who really got sucked into that ideology, despite the fact that they knew better from their scripture. And so we need to be talking to people, talking to our neighbors, talking to people who are getting drawn in, because fear is a biblical condition, right? That scripture speaks to all the time. Fear not. Fear not. Right. How many times do we have that in the Bible? Yeah. And then God didn't give us a spirit of fear and timidity, but a spirit of power, love, and self-control. I just love that verse. And so we need to help people act out of love and not out of fear right now.
So they can go to faithinpubliclife.org, get connected to all the good things happening. And I'm proud to be I don't know if I'm a member yet.
You will be soon.
I sure should be. Yeah. I mean,
you can follow us on Facebook too.
I do that. Live. I do all that. I'm a fanboy. I forward. I tell people about you.
Your audience.
I just don't know that I don't know that I'm a member yet. I need to reconcile
we only
that.
Gave you the opportunity recently.
Yeah, just last Friday, right, or a couple Fridays ago. So this is new. So if anyone's followed this, it's a new thing. And Jen, thanks for all the good work that you're doing.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's great to talk to you all.